For today's video, I wanted to show you guys how you can take a extremely overdeveloped image. It could be overexposed too. This won't make it look like a normally developed or normally exposed image, but at least gets it to a point that it's usable. So to start off here, we can see this is pretty washed out and there's lots of weird color shifts. I mean, like up here in the main part of the image, this looks alright, but in the shadows, there's lots of blues and the blacks are uneven. So this was converted in Negative Lab Pro, just with the standard settings. No adjustments have been made here. I didn't even mess with the white balance. This is just all standard. Only thing I did change, just in the conversion, I used the basic color model. That's the only change on this. Everything else is just as it comes out, default from Negative Lab Pro. So I'm gonna send this to Photoshop, so we can work some magic here. Whoops, there we go. Okay, so we've got this in Photoshop. What we're going to do is jump into Camera Raw filter. And this is kind of like Lightroom inside Photoshop. We'll get to, I have all the settings, all the adjustments that's in Lightroom. Everything's normal. It's not inverted like how these edits would be in Lightroom using Negative Lab. Cool thing with this is the sliders aren't backwards, they're normal, and this is a raw file. This isn't a TIFF file. So when it gets sent back to Lightroom, it's a TIFF file, but while we're doing the edit in Photoshop, this is a raw file. You can see up at the top here. And that is the name of the file, but it's still a raw file. So that's one cool thing about making these edits in Photoshop, is that it's a raw file, not a TIFF file. There's not a ton of difference between the two, but if you can get away with editing a raw file over a TIFF file, that's the way to go. So what we'll do here to get this rolling is jump into the curves panel and add a little bit of contrast just to set a black point. I'm not gonna go completely black with this, because we'll make adjustments in the RGB panels, but this will just give us a start to get some blacks in the image. So I'm going to go here with about 15 on the input, jump over to the red channel, and what this will do is once we start sliding these over, it'll start removing, I don't know if it's necessarily removing colors, but adjusting them to where everything's at a black point. So right now you can see quite a bit of reds here. There's reds and blues up in this top area here. Down to the bottom, the reds are kind of hard to see, but they are there. And as we slide the slider to the right, you can see those reds kind of get pulled out. Now it's really blue and green. So I'm gonna go with 13 here on the input, jump over to the green channel, and we'll slide that over until we start seeing less green in the image. I'm gonna go with about 10. There's still some green. This is kind of a rough start, and then we can go through and refine it once we get the black points set. But you can see that as we're sliding these over, the image is darkening. The blue channel I'm going to push a little bit more than the other two channels, just because there's a lot of blues in the shadows. By the end of this, we'll get that fixed. So I'm going to come back to the contrast channel and slide this back a little bit, just to bring out some shadow detail, and then run back through the RGB channels and make some smaller adjustments to refine what we've done already and get a better black point set. Sometimes you don't need to make much adjustment once you've done this, but you can always go back and make adjustments. That looks pretty good here. So I think we're done with the curves for now. It's a little contrasty, but that'll be the case. This image was really overdeveloped, so it's going to be contrasty. It's kind of like when you push process in developing, you'll have more contrast. The bright areas will appear brighter and the darks will be darker. Plus this is a night image, so I'll probably end up removing some contrast within reason to try to get a more balanced looking exposure. But again, this is really overdeveloped, so it's gonna have some characteristics of a pushed negative. So to kind of bring back some of the shadow detail, I'm gonna push the darks up, remove some of those, kind of lighten things up a bit. I've done a few edits on this picture, and every time it's gotten a little bit better and a little bit better. And the last one was the cleanest edit so far, but it was a little contrasty for my taste. So on this go around, really gonna focus on having more shadow detail. I want this to be, it needs to be dark because this was shot at nighttime, but I'd like to have less contrast. So I guess not necessarily shadow detail, just less contrast. So I'm gonna push these lights up just a bit. Not a lot, just a little bit. And then bring up the shadows. This is looking okay. Still shadows in the dark parts where they need to be, but there's just a lot more detail. It's not as contrasty, it's not as punchy. And I think I may actually bring the highlights down in this tab. This is cool because if you crank it all the way to the left, it'll drag those way down, but the highlights are a little bit crispy, so I'm gonna drag that down a little bit, just kind of mellow it out. And then to see it before and after with what we've done here, just with the curves panel, we've made a pretty decent adjustment here. Still have some blues in the shadows, but we can work on that in a bit. But you can see the film borders are closer to black, which is good. That's, when we're trying to get a black point, because they're supposed to be solid black. So with that in mind, we'll jump up into the basic tab, and at this point where I would normally be editing, I start in the curves panel. I don't always use the RGB channel adjustments. I don't normally do that unless, like in this instance, the negative's really overexposed or overdeveloped and there's some serious color shifts. Those adjustments just help you bring back to somewhat of a normal baseline to edit from. So we'll jump into the basic tab here. I'm gonna bump up the temperature slightly. These lights were pretty warm, and just with the adjustments we've made, they've cooled off just a touch. So I'm gonna warm that up a little. I'm not gonna mess with the exposure. It looks pretty good as is. May remove just a smidge of contrast. Highlights I'm gonna leave alone. Maybe take them down just a tiny bit, just to help get rid of some of the harshness. Shadows, push those up a little bit, open them up. Whites I'll leave alone. Maybe take down just a tiny bit. Blacks, open those up a little bit more. Now we're looking a little bit flat, but I think what I'll do is make these adjustments, go back into the curves panel on the contrast slider and add a little bit more back in. Texture, just from lots of photo editing I've found from my pictures, I like a little bit of texture, so I bumped that to 2. I did that backwards. Texture at 3, 2. There we go. And dehaze is to taste. I can use more of it here. I'm not gonna do that much, obviously. That's just to kind of help see what it's doing. If you're having a hard time seeing what a slider's doing when you're in Photoshop or Lightroom, just grab it, slide it all the way to the right, all the way to the left, and you can see what it's doing to your picture. I am going to add a little bit of dehaze. I don't normally add vibrance or saturation. I don't mess with those usually. And then we'll jump down here to the detail tab. Add a bit of sharpening. My standard amount is 15. And then come down to detail and just adjust that to 20. And if we zoom in here, kind of look at the chevron here. That was kind of the focal point of the image. Come up to the toggle view. It's going to be pretty minimal, but there is just a slight bump in sharpness. Nothing too crazy, just enough to add a little bit. Next, we'll jump down to color mixer. Zoom back out here so we can see, and this will be neat. We'll be able to remove some of these blues that are in the shadows. So we're on the saturation tab, and we'll come down to the blue slider. Pull that back. And it's starting to pull the blues out of the shadows. They're not completely black, but they're a lot less blue than they were. If we jump up to the toggle visibility, you can see how much blue that removed from the shadows. There's still some there. I could probably pull back the purples a little bit. I don't want to do it completely though, because there's a bunch of green in there too still. So we'll pull that back just a bit. And then maybe the magentas. Not so much, so the magentas aren't affecting the asphalt down here, but there is magenta in this shadow here. I will pull a little bit of it out, but I don't want to go too crazy because it just doesn't look quite right. So pull a little bit of that out. That looks pretty good. I like the P key to do it before and after. Oh wow, that's considerably better. Look how much blue we pulled out of that. Jeez, that's considerable. Cleaned that up quite a bit. And you can mess around with the luminance. I'm not really going to do that so much here. If you need to make adjustments to areas that are too bright or maybe a little dark, you can make adjustments on the luminance. If you crank the slider, it'll go too much, but you can make these nice little fine adjustments to things. Just refine your image and clean things up. Get things nice and tight. And again, if you slide the sliders back and forth, you can see what exactly each slider is affecting. So I'll add just that back just a bit. Mostly just glare on the window. So I'm gonna pull that back a little. And I can actually add a little bit of contrast back into the asphalt on the blues if we drag the luminance down a little bit, because there's still a lot of blue in there. That kind of helps darken that up just a little bit. And the purples darkens it quite a bit, so I'm not going to do much there, just a tiny bit. Don't want to go too crazy because I do want to have some detail there. That looks super clean. So at this point, close camera raw filter. And I know these film borders don't look super awesome. Oh, I forgot, I was going to go back in and just adjust the contrast panel in the curves, just to add a little bit more contrast, kind of darken these edges and corners a bit. So let me jump back up in here, curves. All right, I'm not gonna go too crazy, I just want a little bit. Oh, I'm on the wrong thing. Control Z to undo. There we go, that's the tab I want. I don't want to darken this up too much because I just removed quite a bit of contrast. And this will add a lot. I mean, if I'm just going to 14, that adds quite a bit of contrast. I don't want it to go too crazy. Just enough to make it look nice. And I think that's good. That's 5. Nothing too crazy. Just tightens things up a bit. We'll adjust the film borders in part 2 of this series. See you in the next video.